I'm Norman Hill. I'm the producer of this DVD, and I'm joined by director Richard Stanley. Richard?
Yep.
What was the purpose behind making this film?
Well, I suppose at the end of the day, the purpose behind making this film was trying to save my worthless soul in some way. Initially, I got involved in this when I was working for Channel 4 Television's religion department. They had made a documentary called The Grail Jurassic Park about retrieving dinosaur DNA from amber, and they thought they could do something similar with the Grail Raiders of the Lost Ark. They wanted a backstory on the Indiana Jones thing. And they sent me to Europe, basically, to research what the Nazis were up to back in the 1930s and whether they were really looking for the Ark of the Covenant. I realized pretty fast that they weren't, and that there was no decent Ark of the Covenant story. There was, however, a very good Nazi Grail story, and once I got on the thread, it was very hard to let go of it. Channel 4 stopped being interested once I couldn't give them the Ark of the Covenant. And initially I went on with my life, and it was only after the whole Dr. Moreau affair that I came back to it all. Mostly because some of the stuff that had happened when we were doing the initial research was so out of order and so hard for me to explain that when I was trying to put the pieces together and think about what elements in my life did make sense to me, the one thing I couldn't get my head around was what we'd seen in the south of France in Montsegur a few years previously. And I was drawn back into it to try and understand it just for my own personal purposes. I mean, the trouble of Secret Glory is it's still not finished. This is very much a work in progress. It's something that has absorbed so much time and money that we basically had to put it down in the state it's in at the moment. But it's still very rough, and it really raises more questions than it answers.
So conceivably, we could see a different cut of this movie several years down the road.
I certainly hope so, and then I hope that a more complete version of Secret Glory will eventually be available. It's, in a funny way, it's actually too short in its current cut. It's still way over feature length, but it's still too short to really make sense of some of the issues that it raises.
And what are these images we're looking at over the title sequence?
Almost all the still photographs in this film obviously are leftover Nazi bits and pieces. Most of the images over the title sequence are this is now the actual staff of the Wewelsburg, the SS order castle. Previously there were images from the Lebensborn from the Nazi breeding program, which has just become declassified this year. For the first time, they've declassified the documents now on the Lebensborn, only 70, 80 years later, which is why, of course, another reason why it's incomplete is certain aspects of it, like the Lebensborn and the Nazi polar expeditions, remain more or less classified to the present day. It's very, very difficult to find out anything about that kind of material. Talk
a little bit about what we're seeing here with this title card.
We stuck this little title
Ron.
Yeah, we stuck this little title card in the beginning so that people could know what the movie was about right at the front. There's always, like with Voice of the Moon and the other documentaries, there's a certain amount of question marks over it, and people sort of want an easy statement of intent right at the beginning. Otto Rahn was obviously the man who was meant to have found the Holy Grail. The story that goes that Rahn found the Holy Grail in 1934 is basically the character that the evil archaeologist in Raiders of the Lost Ark is based on. René Belloc in the movie. In real life, Rahn's interpreter was a man named René Nelly, and the next town along from Montsegur is the town of Belloc, and I think the name in Raiders of the Lost Ark is a contraction of the two names. Otto Rahn wrote a book called Crusade Against the Grail, which also lends its title to the last Indiana Jones movie, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade.
Yeah, and in fact, in the third film, they were actually seeking the Holy Grail.
Yeah, I particularly had a problem with the third movie just because it felt like the material was so much better than the movie, in that the actual story was so much wilder than what they'd come up with in the film, and there are so many great bad guys for a Steven Spielberg movie. Particularly Otto's boss, we'll get to him later, is just crying out to be in some kind of 1930s adventure movie. But coming back to the actual material, what we're seeing on screen at the beginning are scenes from Wildenborg Castle in the Black Forest. Wildenborg is where Wolfram von Eschenbach wrote a poem called Parsifal in the 12th century. Rahn's whole take on it was based on the idea that Parsifal was not a work of fiction, but was a work of history. He was inspired by the discovery of Troy. This chappie what was his name, I believe, Schellenberg, found Troy by deciding that Homer's Iliad was not a poem but was a work of history, and went herring off to look for the ruins of Troy and succeeded in finding it. Raan believed that the story of Parsifal, the story of the discovery of the Holy Grail, was likewise based on a real story, and set out trying to find the genealogical roots of the characters in the Grail story and trying to find the actual castle itself.
And so what was the genesis of this? You got commissioned by Channel 4. As you started into the project, you realized you were taking a different tact. What then became the foundation for this film?
Well, basically the tack we were on at the beginning was the same as the Da Vinci Code. We spent a lot of time in Rennes-le-Château. We got sucked into the whole bloodline of Christ, Rennes-le-Château, Holy Blood, Holy Grail, Ark of the Covenant story, which was actually very boring, and I essentially didn't believe it. At the end of the day, I think it's, there's a lot of fraudulent material in there, and I just didn't really take it on board. But right in the middle of it all, we ended up in the tiny town of Montsegur in the south of France. And in Montsegur, we met an old lady named Madame Cuquet. And Madame Cuquet was still keeping Otto's rooms where he'd stayed from before the war, and told us about this young German who'd been out there. And then I took my girlfriend up to the ruins of Montsegur, the Cathar Castle on top of the mountain. We went up there to basically smoke a joint and look at the setting sun. But while we were up there, this very big cloud came around the mountain very fast, like something out of Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And then bolts of lightning started to come out of the cloud. We ran down from the battlements and got very scared, and the castle started sort of sucking in the lightning. About 4 or 5 different beams of plasma were kind of being drawn into the castle walls at once, and this very intense, blinding light was coming out of it. Coupled with a very strong, sort of sickly sweet smell, we became very frightened. I think we both started crying. I threw all my money away. I took my shoes off because I didn't want any metal left on me. I wanted to try and make myself non-conductive to the electricity. There were literally sort of ribbons of plasma flowing across the mountainside below us as well as above us. So we didn't know where to hide. And it very quickly reduced us into a state of terrified, superstitious awe. The lady I was with had some kind of epileptic seizure, which I think was because of the electromagnetic fields. When you've got current of that kind of nature passed around you at that kind of level, it actually changes the electromagnetic field. The castle naturally forms something called a Faraday shield, which you can do practically anything with that. Certainly it's enough to induce epilepsy. I mean, I know they use it for levitation, for actual sort of hovercrafts or floating frogs and things in science. But we realized at once that the castle had properties which were unknown, which we didn't understand. And that kind of drew me back into it. Initially I was dismissing it as being a myth or some kind of wild notion, but the moment we actually saw the thing lighting up like that and we saw the light pouring out of the castle, we realized that it was more than we understood.